Well, a very, very good afternoon, everybody, and may I introduce British broadcasting legend, Peter Purves.
Thanks very much.
We're talking about iconic TV. We've got to talk about the longest-running programme in the history of TV, Doctor Who, which you kind of really sort of found your TV fame in Doctor Who.
Yes, I did, actually. I mean, not a lot of people knew, certainly before I gave my talks earlier in the week, that I'd spent 10 years as an actor before I became a television presenter, and Doctor Who was one of the things that I was lucky enough to appear in. I did 44 episodes of that. So yes, that was a great time for me, and never made much money out of it because there was no money. I mean, the BBC didn't pay money in those days. I think we paid them to work. It was a seriously cheap jack all the way through, but it was a fascinating time. And again, that was always done as live because they couldn't afford to edit. That we recorded these shows originally, the very first Doctor Who's, which started in 1963. I joined it in 1965 with William Hartnell, the original Doctor, and I replaced Jacqueline Hill and Russell Enoch, William Russell, who was they were the two original companions. They were school teachers for what was ostensibly the Doctor's granddaughter who had been at school in the very first episode. I remember seeing that and thinking, well, this is great television. Well, I joined it 2 years later, and very few of the episodes I made remain as complete serials. The BBC used to wipe these tapes because big 2-inch tape was very difficult to store, took up a huge amount of space, but also it was very expensive, and they needed to reuse them. It wasn't only Doctor Who that they had tapes wiped. I don't know if you remember when Pete and Dud were doing Not Only But Also, a lot of their stuff was wiped as well. But Alan Bennett, who was also a member of the Beyond the Fringe team, he had a wonderful series at that time in the early 60s called On the Margin. Brilliant comedy series, very sophisticated, very funny. Not one single frame of that remains. The BBC wiped a lot. They didn't archive any of it. And I think that's absolutely tragic. They didn't officially archive any of the Doctor Who stuff. They just let it go. All of the serials I appeared in, which I think were 9, was it 9 serials?
About 9 series, yeah.
They all now exist in audio form because although at the time there was no means of having domestic recordings of television, because there were no domestic television recorders. They didn't come until the mid-1970s, and then they were terribly expensive. Not many people got them until VHS came in the early 80s or the late 70s. Excuse me. I'm trying to. What was the question? Because I've lost the thread. I get carried away with these things. Oh yes, the only means of recording was fans watching the show had the gumption at the time to stick a microphone in front of the television, and so the sound was recorded, and they existed. Our producer called Mark Ayres managed to track all of these down, and he's done it not only for mine but for other artists who appeared on the show as well. And every single episode we did has now been remade as a BBC audio book, and they're really rather good. Though I say it myself, they make very good radio plays because the soundtrack is used exactly as it went out, because the purists would object if gaps and pauses that were in it originally were removed, and fluffs, because Bill Hartnell fluffed his way through the show quite extensively as the Doctor, and they were affectionately known as Billy Fluffs. They were never cut out because they couldn't edit, they couldn't retake and edit them out. They couldn't afford to. They only were allowed, I think, 3 edits per programme, and that mainly covered special effects, things like the TARDIS arriving and disappearing and various other bits when we had to stop tape because you couldn't move from one part of the studio to the other and get enough cameras moved across. So, but because of the efforts of people like Mark Ayres, we end up with a full library of all of these programmes, which really are very good. And the ones that do exist, DVDs now mean that we can do additional material for that. I'm making those all the time now. I think I've got a couple coming out early in the spring, haven't I?
You have indeed. Well, the Time Meddler has been out for a little while. In the new year, I believe you've got the Ark and the Gunfighters. The Gunfighters one about Doc Holliday, isn't it?
Doc Holliday, yes. That was quite interesting. I mean, it's lovely how they make these stories work together. We arrived. It was a Western directed by Rex Tucker. Had a lot of very well-known actors in. Lawrence Payne, who was quite a matinee idol at the time. He came in there as one of the goodies. Was he Wyatt Earp? No, Wyatt Earp was an American. We had Shane Rimmer in there, Bill Herndell, a lot of very good actors. And this was a serial which was telegraphed by the end of the previous serial. Someone gave the doctor, I can't remember, it might have been me, someone gave the doctor a sweet and he cracks his tooth on it. So in the next bit, he's got to go and see a doctor. Doc Holliday's there, who of course was a dentist. And that was the tie-in, but that was great fun. I mean, it's marvelous serials to work on. They really were very funny. Some of them weren't as successful as others. The second serial I did was a thing called Galaxy 4. I did this one which you've just mentioned, which was the Meddling Monk. No, the Time Meddler. It was called, with Peter Butterworth as the meddling monk. Very funny performance, very good performance from him. And we followed that. That was my initial serial. And I was quite a heroic character in that. It was a really nice part for me to play. It was the character that I'd been told by the story editor that this is what I would be asked to play, and it suited me. I felt very happy with that. The next serial was called Galaxy 4. The writer had not been told, or I didn't have enough time, but had not been told that Bill Russell and Jackie Hill had left the series and I joined it until very late on. He then had to rewrite his story to accommodate me rather than them. Now, his storyline rather featured Jacqueline Hill. So it was a very feminine-oriented character that I had to play. I mean, I don't mean by that I had to be gay or anything like that, but what I mean is that it wasn't a butch hero character, because the baddies in this were 4 Amazonian, wonderful-looking ladies. And I had to get captured by them, and I couldn't escape. Now, come on, do me a favor. But, I mean, had I been captured by 4 Amazonian ladies, I might have liked it. But none of that was in the story either. But they hadn't been told. The story editor had not passed on the information, or didn't know until too late, because I was only cast about 7 weeks before as this character, Stephen Taylor. So it was quite difficult then playing that. And I didn't know. I mean, I didn't know the reason for it, but I read the scripts and I thought, oh, come on, there's nothing for me to play in this. And I got very despondent about that. The character got better, though, as the serials went on, and in the end had some quite nice funny pieces to play, and 1 or 2 leading chunks which were very good. There was one in particular called The Massacre, where the Doctor really took a back seat. It was actually one of the first attempts by the BBC to write Bill Hartnell out of the serial, because he was beginning to get that little bit irascible and difficult to work with, and they thought, well, maybe it's the end of the road for him. And ultimately, of course, shortly after I left, it was the end of the road for him, and he went as well.
Because during production, Bill Hartnell would often actually take a week off, wouldn't he? And I believe in The Meddling Monk, there was one episode, where he just didn't appear at all. He was just trapped in a prison for a whole episode, and you went off and had your adventure.
I wasn't sure that was in The Meddling Monk, but it might have been. You're more of a fan than I am, so you'll remember more. I can't clearly remember, but it did happen. Yes, I mean there was one called The Celestial Toymaker, where the Doctor he in the first instance we see him with the Celestial Toymaker, who's this very mischievous and wicked man, who makes the Doctor invisible. So all we see of the Doctor is his hand playing a game. And this hand plays the game. That allowed Bill to be off for 2.5 weeks, which was, he needed the breaks. He did need the breaks. He played 2 characters in the Massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve, but again, very minusculely. He was out, you know, we could lose him for various parts because the story was quite confusing. Other times he played a major role all the way through. I mean, I like Bill a lot. I got on with him extremely well, and he was very generous, very kind to me. He didn't suffer fools gladly. He didn't like directors who There was one or two directors he really didn't get on with. There was one called Dougie Camfield who could do no wrong. There was another called Michael Leaston Smith who could do no right. And if Billy took against you, then you were in trouble to a certain extent.
It's funny that you mentioned the William Hartnell playing the puzzle, because you actually decided to take that puzzle home with you as a souvenir, didn't you?
Funny story, actually, this. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that at the time there was something in it. At this time, this time in the 60s, 1966, there was quite a cult for believing in the mysticism of pyramids, even small pyramids, in which people were persuaded if you could put a razor blade inside this pyramid, then it will always stay sharp, and various things like that. There was sort of energy fields attached to them. This game, well, you gave me the name of it earlier. You said
it was based on the Tower of Hanoi, which was lots of different concentrically sized blocks that you got to try and get on top of each other.
I didn't know it existed as a name like that, but anyway, in the Celestial Toymaker, it was called the Trilogic game. And the Doctor had to play this game and win it, because if he didn't win it, he would die, and so too would me and Dodo, his companions, and end of Doctor Who, all finished. The game, as you so rightly described, was a triangular base and 9 other segments. So there were 10 segments in all, arriving at a point. So the smallest one at the top, the slightly bigger one, right the way down to the base one. There were also 3 points on the playing board, on the playing surface. And this pyramid stood on one of them. The game was to move the pyramid to any of the other spaces and reassemble it without ever putting a bigger piece on a smaller piece. It could be done in 137 moves if you didn't make a mistake. And that was the task set for the Doctor. If you think about it, it's not too complicated. Take the smallest piece, which has the point, put it there. Take the next piece and put it there. Take the smallest piece and put it there. So far, easy. Take the next piece and put it there. Take the smallest piece and put it there. Take the next smallest piece and put it there. Take the smallest piece and put it there. We now have 3 in a rise. Now the concentration gets fierce, as you can imagine, as you get further along. Where do you move them? In which order do you take them? Very, very common. I could play it, and I thought this was a really nice prop. And at the end of the serial, I asked the designer, I said, what's going to happen to it? He said, oh, it's going to end up in the bin. I said, can I have it? So yeah. So I took it home. And it was a sort of talking piece at home, and I'd get people to try it, and no one could do it. I mean, it's not the sort of thing you do manage first time, unless you really concentrate very hard. So I mean, it was quite a nice thing to have. But when I left Doctor Who, my work dried up. Nowadays, if you do a serial like Doctor Who and you do 44 episodes in it, boy, are you going to be made for life or what? It didn't happen then. There were 3 television channels. That was all. Television was still not considered the place for actors to work. People looked down their nose if you did a commercial or you're working on television. That's not where real actors work. The theatre is the place. And there was still that sort of element about. It was changing, but it was there. And my work dried up. I did a few odd bits for directors that I worked with on Doctor Who. I did episodes of Z-Cars. I did the odd film piece like Red Cap, I think, was one of the serials which went out, which was filmed at Pinewood. And I did odd bits, but I didn't work a lot. And my career sort of stopped. And after 18 months, it was really in a very dire state. And I began to try and find reasons for it. I was on the point of giving up the business because I wasn't making any money. There was, you know, I had no career going. I was doing the odd bit here and there, but nothing was developing. And I thought, well, I'm really sunk. I got a letter then from my agent saying, Peter, we're very sorry, but we really don't think we can do anything for you. You know, we've tried. There's nothing happening. We think you'd probably do better if you got a different agent who would try and move you on. So that, for me, was the ultimate blow. I was sinking lower and lower and getting very depressed. And I was thinking often, I thought about this Trilogic game, and I thought, it's that bloody mystical thing. It's that. That's causing me the problem. And so I took it downstairs and I chuck it in the communal bins. I was living in a very nice block of flats in Kensington at the time, and I took it down and I dumped it in there. The following morning, I got a phone call from the agent saying, look, I know we've sent you that letter and we're sticking by that. We think you should get another agent, but we thought we'd let you know. We just had a phone call from a program called Blue Peter, and they would like to see you. If you would like to see them, here's the telephone number. And so I rang them up, and they asked me to go in and see them. And I saw Edward Barnes and Billy Baxter and Rosemary Gill, and 3 auditions later, I'd got the best job in television. Now, whether it was anything to do with getting rid of the Trilogic game, I'm not going to say. But it was coincidental that that happened then. I don't want to bore you, for those of you who've heard the story before, but what had actually happened, and I didn't find out until over 10 years later when I left Blue Peter, that there is a lady at the National Theatre whose job it is to reply to actors who've written in asking if there's any work for them and sending their CV and photographs. She writes back and sends them her photographs back when there isn't anything. And she'd been having dinner with a group of people, including Edward Barnes, who was the assistant producer on Blue Peter. And he mentioned at the dinner party that they were looking for a replacement for Christopher Trace. And had she got anyone on her books who might fit the bill? And she hadn't. She couldn't think of anybody. And that was the end of it. About 3 days later, she was having dinner again with a group of people, one of whom was a gentleman called Giles Havergal. Now, I'd been in repertory in Barrow-in-Furness in Lancashire, and when my son was born, I'd gone back to Barrow, because that's where my parents lived, to let them see their new grandson. And I went down to the theatre where I'd worked for 2 years. Giles Havergal had since taken over as artistic director. I'd never met him before. And I went and saw a play and met him in the bar afterwards, had a drink and a chat. He said if ever I wanted to do a play there, I could come back and do one. That was fine. We met in total for about, I don't know, 45 minutes. And that's all. He was having dinner with this lady who happened to mention her conversation with Edward Barnes, and Giles said, I know someone who would be very good at that, and mentioned me. I knew nothing about this. I had no contact. I have not seen Giles Havergal since. I know that he became artistic director at the Glasgow Citizens Theatre. Very successful man, very nice man. By all accounts, I don't really know him, but I'd met him that once. But he is fundamentally responsible for my career taking off again. Because right out of the blue, the lady contacted Edward Barnes. I was asked to audition, and that's the rest is history, as they say. But it's amazing how lucky I became for the next 20 or 30 years, having got rid of this rather stupid game.
Fantastic.
I don't believe that either.
All right, what we're going to do now is we're going to go over to the audience. So if anyone has got any questions, please do raise your hand, and I will come out and I will bring the microphone to you.
Don't show, I don't bite.
Oh, we've got one at the back. Right, I'll come over to you.
Doctor Who ran very, very successfully for a number of years in its old format, and more recently there's been a resurgence with a bigger budget, much higher production values, if you like. What's your take on the revamp of the new type of Doctor Who? Do you think it's a good series?
Yes and no. I particularly like Christopher Eccleston when they first brought it back. I think to be honest, I think the old Doctor Who had run its course long before it stopped. I think in the early stages, when there was that serendipity about not knowing where the TARDIS would end up because it was broken, that got lost somewhere along the way. And I think it got bogged down. I knew John Pertwee very well. I mean, he was a good personal friend as well as being the third Doctor. But when he took over, I never really took to him as the Doctor. I didn't like the way it got locked into being in the UK with the organisation called UNIT, and we had the army stuff all the time. I thought that was a real cop-out. And then it changed and went on a bit. There were some very good Doctors. I think Sylvester McCoy was a very good one when it was ending, but I don't think the series was much cop then. I think they'd lost the direction for it, and that's why it came off. There was enough demand for it to come back, and I think Christopher Eccleston was a brilliant Doctor. I'm not a fan of David Tennant, I'm afraid. I didn't take to him there at all. However, the production values are startling. I mean, the amount of money they spend on the current Doctor Who is absolutely phenomenal compared with what was spent when we did it. I mean, they didn't spend anything on it. It really was peanuts time. The BBC didn't want to keep the show on. They wanted to lose it. But they couldn't. It was too popular. It built up that cult following. The Daleks made it. I hated the Daleks. Couldn't stand the Daleks. But I mean, they actually made the series really take off. It went stratospheric at that point. And we got massive audiences, you know. We did get huge audiences. I always liked the historical ones that we did, but those got the poorer audiences, surprisingly. It was always the sci-fi ones that did better. But no, I think the BBC have done the right thing in bringing it back. It's a very spectacular series. I don't know how everyone else feels about it, though. I get very confused with the plots. They're too... No, but I mean, they're so fast-moving. There was a simplicity about the old Doctor Who that I loved. I thought that really did work. It was very good narrative. It told the story very well. Now I don't think the stories are that clear. I'm not sure what's going on. Having said that, I think the new boy who's playing the Doctor is perfect casting, because I look at him and I can see in him a future Bill Hartnell. You know, I can see him growing into the Doctor who I believe to be the definitive Doctor, who was Billy Hartnell.
Lovely. Do we have any more questions on the front row?
Are there any props that you took home other than the game?
No, there weren't actually. They weren't very generous with things like that. Normally you'd have to pay for them, but as I knew that this one was definitely intended for the dustbins at the BBC, wasn't going to be kept at all, then I felt it was a very good move to take it away. No, nothing else at all. It's a shame. I suppose if I'd been a collector of memorabilia, I'm not. The only time, you know, that I've spent talking about or thinking seriously about the past is when I was writing my autobiography, which was in the latter part of 2008, and it was published in 2009. And events like this, and going to Doctor Who conventions occasionally, and occasionally doing after-dinner talks, those are the only times that I think about the past. I'm very, very forward-looking. I still look forward to tomorrow far more than I look back at things with enjoyment. I do enjoy reminiscing from time to time, but often it's the only time I think about it is when someone asks me a particular question, and it triggers off a memory. And you go, oh yeah, I remember that and that. But then I'll probably never think about it again until someone asks the same question a while on down the line. But no, we didn't take stuff home and didn't collect stuff. I don't have a TARDIS or a Dalek in the garden.
I take it you still have your Blue Peter badge, though, do you?
I have 2 gold Blue Peter badges, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you please put your hands together for the fantastic Peter Purves?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks very much, Martin.